Hello, I'm Don Barraclough. I'm the Managing Director of Finch Consulting, and I have my colleague here, Sue Dearden, who's Head of Legal Services at Finch. I'm very interested, not just from a Finch perspective, but from our client's perspective, how we manage the ongoing risks from COVID. To give COVID deaths some UK context, the weekly deaths attributed to COVID have risen week on week in the last 9 weeks, and they currently average about 100 a day, which means the UK is currently losing to COVID each and every 48-hour period roughly the same number of staff and members of the public killed annually by workplace accidents, which is quite an amazing statistic, really. That means, and I've made some notes here, there are more lives lost every day to COVID than were lost in the Grenfell Tower and Hillsborough as well. And yet my perception is the removal of sort of the government mandated measures has been interpreted by many as a reason just to remove or ignore the COVID control measures that we've got so used to, and that have been put in place by employers and of course a lot of Finch clients, including Finch ourselves.
Yeah, I think in some senses we've become so inured to the numbers that they just cease to have significance to people.
Yeah, I think if we were having that number of people killed on train crashes every day, we'd have to rethink our commute just a little bit, wouldn't we?
Yeah, it would make you stand up and take notice. And it's really a curious feature of this, that so many people can be infected and ill and dying, and yet there seem to be a number of people out and about not taking the risk seriously. And the reasoning for that is, I think, fueled by the press, which sort of heralded 19th of July as being Freedom Day, and people have assumed that the lifting of mandated restrictions in some ways means that the restrictions are no longer relevant, that they don't have to use them.
So a more binary approach to life, it's just switch off,
Yeah,
it's finished.
and that is not the case. I mean, the risk of infection from the workplace, from people in the workplace and to others, is sort of no different to any other health and safety risk in many ways. And an employer is not only entitled but obliged legally to assess the risks to health and safety to their staff and to others who may be affected by their workplace, by their workplace premises, to assess those risks and then control them through a risk management process. So that needs to be done in relation to COVID, just as you would with anything else, any other risk.
So it's time really to start thinking of COVID as part of the other whole profile of different hazards that a workplace has to cope with, really, not just as a standalone individual thing. Yeah.
Absolutely, and stop thinking it in terms of controls have been removed, therefore they no longer have relevance, or that in some way the employers can no longer require that they are used. That, of course, is not the case.
Yeah, it's interesting because it does seem to have gone the wrong way around, doesn't it? We've removed the controls, but we've still got the hazard. Whereas actually what you should be doing is removing the hazard, then you can start to bring down your controls and eventually remove them.
Yeah.
As you say, it's just gone. The controls have just gone.
One thing I find very curious about the sort of public perception, the way people are behaving, is that you tend to accept controls within a workplace. The government doesn't mandate that everybody must wear a hard hat all the time. They don't mandate that you have to have hearing protection all the time, or steel cap boots, or PPE, or any of the other controls that come in. It leaves it to the employers to identify when it's needed, when it's necessary, because of the risk. And the risk is, of course, different in different circumstances. The risk is different when you're outside. The risk is different if you can remain distanced. The risk is different if people are vaccinated. The risk is different if you the list is almost endless, isn't it? And there are too many variables for the government to say, right, everybody must wear masks or do this or do that or do the other, except in these circumstances, because they'd never finished that job, which is why they've lifted the mandate from it and have sort of turned it onto employers to assess and manage and enforce the controls that are appropriate to their environments. you can try and manage the situation as far as who's coming into your premises, who's working on your premises, who's visiting your premises, and you are obliged to look at those risks and control those risks, applying the principles of the hierarchy of controls. So the first obligation is obviously to think about elimination of the risk, which in practical terms you can't do, but the obligation is to take reasonably practicable steps to do that. And that may be insisting on vaccinations. It may be that you have you insist on testing. There are different ways of trying to eliminate it from the workforce.
So as an employer, when you're doing your risk assessment, you almost have to consider worst case for your workers at home to prevent it coming into the workplace then. Although you have no control with the people at home, do you? You've got to assume that...
You've got to assume that they might be coming in infected, yes.
Yeah.
I think that's absolutely right.
Yes.
So you do what you can to minimise that risk, and then do your best to minimise the risk when they're in the workplace. Yes.
It's interesting.
Yeah. And, I think that some people are... I've seen a lot of notices around saying, up to you whether you want to wear a mask. Well, either a mask is a control measure that's needed, mask, wrong word, face covering, I think is more appropriate. But if it's an appropriate control measure, it should be clear, stated, and enforced. You don't just leave it to people's discretion. You don't say to someone, wear a hard hat if you fancy it on this construction site. You just don't do that. No. If it's appropriate, you have it and you enforce it. And if people are resistant to following the controls because of Freedom Day, then just remind them of Section 7 of the Health and Safety at Work Act. If an employee fails to follow an employer's reasonable control measures, then they are vulnerable to prosecution themselves. They're in breach of Section 7, which is punishable by imprisonment or a fine. And it doesn't take a very bad breach to reach the custody threshold. So prison is a realistic possibility, when there's a breach. And of course, you've got different situations. That's employees. It's different for visitors coming in. So if you've got a restaurant or a theme park or somewhere where you have lots and lots of visitors, but you do have the right to refuse them entry if they're not complying with your rules. I mean, if you'd put walkways in place saying, we've got construction works going on in this part, you've got to follow this, you would expect people to follow it. And if they climbed over those barriers to go and have a look at the diggers, you'd be getting them off your premises soon enough. Just manage the risk as you would any other risk.
It's very interesting, isn't it? Because it's all about how over this period and communication has been given to the general public, to workers, and you can appreciate with a moving, almost feels like a moving target, how difficult it can be to keep up, which maybe also is a reason that when we came to Freedom Day, a lot of our clients decided to keep with their current control measures and still do now.
Yeah, not all though.
No, not all. There are exceptions, but we're certainly advising all of our clients, look at your risk assessment, revise it, but actually some of the revisions that they're doing are not significant. They're keeping to the current measures.
Risk assessment has to be fluid because what we know about coronavirus is changing all the time. And so, for example, with the double jabs, we had the conversation about jabs for jobs, whether it was justified, whether it wasn't. And I was very much an advocate at the beginning of, yes, insist on 2 jabs.
Yes.
And I've sort of moved from that position in the sense that there may be instances where that is entirely appropriate, but it may be limited to sort of care home environments where people are having very close contact with very vulnerable people. But for other environments, I worry a little bit that the fact that people have thrown off the controls, or appear to have in many cases thrown off the controls, leaves people who are double vaccinated just a little more gung-ho about the risks. So in fact they become a higher hazard because of their behaviours. So people who are double vaccinated thinking, well, if I catch it, and I might, increasingly the evidence is that you might, I'm not going to get it so seriously. But actually, if you don't get it so seriously, or if you don't display symptoms but you are infectious, does somebody who's double vaccinated then find, would potentially you find that they don't take the symptoms so seriously, test soon enough because they don't want to be isolated to find that they have got COVID. It doesn't affect me so much, so do I need to worry about it and come into the workplace and spread the infection? Whereas somebody not vaccinated might be more cautious, and at the first sign of any sort of ill health might be testing more and prepared to test more because they feel that they are potentially more vulnerable.
In your risk assessment, you therefore probably can't take account of the fact of how many people have or have not got double vaccines then.
Well, I think I think you can take account of it if you know that people have been, but I think that it might be prudent now to be cautious about people being less cautious because they're vaccinated and taking account of that as part of the risk assessment.
Because there is a misconception amongst some, I believe, where it feels though the double vaccine is a shield. Effectively, it's not. It is just a mitigation, isn't it? It's not a prevention. It's a mitigation.
Yeah.
If you do get it, hopefully you'll be less ill. And the message that was quite clear in lockdown was we're trying to stop people going into our hospitals where we can't cope with it. And you may have, I certainly have got friends who have COVID and are ill and have had double jabs, but they're not in hospital. Yes. They feel poorly, very poorly.
Not all of them though. Some of them don't feel poorly at all,
of course,
but have done tests because they've been pinged and then find that they've got it, but meanwhile been coming into the workplace. My point is that somebody not vaccinated might have done that test sooner. It's quite interesting. Somebody's raised with me before now, if we have jabs for jobs, do you end up then saying to people, well, people get flu every year. Do we need to have those jabs every year as a condition? And I mean, flu, about 30,000 people die each year in the UK from flu, which, compared with 132,000-ish who've died from coronavirus is clearly different. And also flu predominantly kills the elderly over 75s who make up much less of the workforce. So as an employer, you might be less concerned with flu than with COVID that impacts everybody, increasingly, everybody of all ages and those at work in particular. Though I have read recently that the concern is that flu is going to be a bigger issue this winter than COVID, perversely, because last year there was hardly any flu because everybody was locked down and staying at home, so it didn't spread. So we've lost some natural immunity to flu through that. And it may be a bigger issue than we think. It's
very interesting, isn't it, Sue? Because as we approached Freedom Day, other diseases did become available, didn't they? It seemed for a long time that for a year only COVID was available to us, but we've got flu, we've got tummy bugs, and even just the normal cold. It's going to be interesting over the next few years how this rolls out through society. An interesting point is, although we're talking about health and safety legislation here, talking to a couple of our food clients, they acknowledge they've got duties under the Health and Safety at Work Act, etc. But what they also say is that if we lose many more people, we're not going to be able to have a business because we can't make product. So one of their prime drivers for putting these measures in place is they just don't want to lose any more people. And they've got to keep going.
That's an economic prime driver behind having the double vaccine, because now the rules change. You don't have to isolate if you've been pinged as having had contact but are symptomless.
As you say, that's the sort of economics balance with the health and safety, and as they said, that's a very real driver. I mean, we're not here to talk about Brexit and all of those things, but it has been a bit of a perfect storm, hasn't it, in places?
It has.
So employers are under quite a bit of stress and strain to get this right, I think. Yeah, that's very interesting.
So going back to risk assessments, Dom, obviously there are a host of controls that you need to be thinking about: distance, face coverings, hand sanitizers, and all those sorts of things. And we've talked briefly about vaccinations as being part of legitimate control measures. What's your feeling about testing and requiring testing?
Yeah, I'm a big fan of it, if I'm honest with you. I like that we've got the two-tier system as well, the lateral flow test and the PCR, the more official PCR. So my wife's a teacher, She has to test regularly, twice a week. We've put testing into the nest here in Finch for the people that work in the office all of the time, but also for people who are coming in to have a test. We've also got test kits downstairs in reception. If they forget to do a test on the way, that's fine. They can sit there for 20 minutes, half an hour. I think you get the result a little bit quicker.
And get booted out very quickly if it's positive.
Exactly. And we just turf you into the car park.
Yeah.
And also my son plays sort of high-level rugby, and to keep that going, that sport, they've been doing a lot of testing to make sure that sort of cohort is there. So I think that works really well.
But there doesn't seem to be the resistance to testing that has been in some quarters to jabs.
Yeah.
So it's in some ways, if you do have people who are resistant to being vaccinated, they can be asked to do the tests. I think that all employees should be asked to do tests twice a week. And that's what the government recommends. Every 3 to 4 days, you do a lateral flow test.
Yeah.
And then if you get symptoms or if you have a positive test, you get back it up with a PCR, don't you?
You do. And to be honest, I think the government did a great job in making these available. You know, you can walk into town, you can go to some supermarkets, you can pick up a whole pack of the lateral flow tests, and you can very easily book yourself onto a PCR. And I've known a number of people who've had the PCRs, and you get them well within the 24-hour period as well. I think it just provides confidence because, as you said earlier, even if you've got a vaccination, it doesn't mean so that you haven't got coronavirus.
Yes.
And we have got some people who are ill, but we've got some people who are just asymptomatic. So how do you pick that up?
Yeah.
I think it just provides that level of an extra level of security, doesn't it?
To me, it's sort of going to the first level of control on the hierarchy of controls, where the obligation is to eliminate risk as so far as reasonably practicable. And to me, that's eliminating the risk coming into the workplace as far as is reasonably practicable. It doesn't guarantee somebody won't get through, but it's as good as I think you can do.
And I think I've thought about the so far as there's reasonably practicable side of it, the time, cost and trouble. Well, there's hardly any cost associated with it. It's not really much trouble, and it doesn't take much time.
Yeah.
So if you are going down that route and looking at how reasonably practicable it is, isn't it?
Yeah.
You can't argue any other way.
Yeah.
I understand that soon at the beginning there were businesses out there wanted to charge 150 quid for a test. I think the government quite quickly moved in on that and made it,
but all the
readily
lateral flow tests are free, and the PCR tests are free when they're needed. So I think we've probably covered everything that we were going to cover. I think
so.
that
It's been really helpful.
The key messages here are that employers must risk assess this. They must risk assess it for the environment in which they're operating, in which they're having staff working and visitors and contractors coming in. They must apply appropriate controls depending upon the level of risk for the environment in which they work. And there is a re-education piece, I think, that employers have got a role to play. The government guidance, which said, okay, we're lifting these controls, doesn't say those controls are going out the window. Those controls are still in place. It is still recommended, just not mandated by the government, that you wear face coverings when you're in an enclosed space, when you're close to people, if there isn't ventilation. Don't be afraid to have those controls and to enforce them.
I think my takeaway from this, Sue, so from a Finch point of view, is we've run the COVID hazard and other hazards slightly separately in two forms of risk assessment we brought together. I think we need to integrate those two together now because COVID isn't going away anytime soon. It's another hazard on our list.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I think we integrate it all together now.
Good point. I'm sure there's a range of views on the topic though, and if anybody has got any different views, that would be very interested to hear from you. And if anybody needs any help with their risk assessments, that's something that we can help with as well. Brilliant. Thank you.
I've enjoyed that. Thank you, Sue.